He's taught for the University of Alberta, Athabasca University, Grand Prairie Regional College, and Assiniboine Community College. His background includes expertise in journalism and media, both as a prominent blogger and as a founder of the Moncton Free Press online news cooperative. He's one of the originators of the first massive open online course, has published frequently about online and networked learning, has authored learning management and content syndication software, and is the author of the widely read e-learning newsletter OL Daily. And Stephen is a member of the National Research Council's Research Ethics Board. So Stephen is going to be presenting, I believe his working title when he contacted me a couple days ago was Why Do Digital Transformations Fail? Thank you for joining us, Stephen.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm hoping the audio is working. I have a bit of an interesting setup here, so there's always the possibility that some things won't be working. Let's see now. Is that screen two? Yes, okay. So I'm going to share my screen here with you. And just so you know, I am live streaming this, hopefully. Oh, I should be recording. Turn on the recording. I like to record on my Pixel phone because that saves me the effort of having to write a transcription of it later. The AI in the phone will do that for me. The topic of this talk is not AI or anything like that. I decided that I didn't want to go in that direction. So what direction did I go, you may ask? I went in the direction of this. Why do digital transformations fail? And pretty sure you're seeing that all right. It's sort of hard to tell, but if there's any problem, somebody will tell me. So, what I want to say, first of all, is that these slides are available on my website, www.down's.ca/presentation/571. And yes, you can do pretty much anything you want with them, except throw them behind the paywall and charge money for them. Please don't do that, because they're intended to be shared. These slides were not authored by any AI, and I didn't use an AI in the production of them at any point. Got to get my, there we go, get my broadcast together. With one possible exception, and that's when I was creating the slides, I used the Microsoft Baby Shower Slideshow theme. Now, why did I use that particular theme? Well, because I could, mostly. And it just goes to show, and it's funny, Sarah talked about, there being no limit to the range of human creativity. I've always thought of human creativity as being something along the lines of taking a technology and using it for a purpose for which it was not designed. And the internet is a classic example of that. Here we have trillions, literally trillions of dollars worth of investment, and we use it to send cat pictures back and forth to each other. And that's kind of hard to duplicate. So, why did I choose this theme, though? Why did I choose why digital transformations will fail? It's not really the typical CNIE topic. CNIE is mostly an academic conference, and as soon as you say the words digital transformation, you're thinking corporate IT and things like that. So there is a bit of a cleave between the two worlds. But I was thinking about, what should I talk about? And I thought, I want to talk about what I was working on the last year. And what I was working on the last year was a project with Defence Research and Development Canada, trying to understand why instructors don't use digital technologies when they're teaching people things like how to do land vehicle control systems and things like that. It was actually a much more interesting exercise than it sounds. So, of course, we don't have any results. Our work was strictly involved in considering what would it take to ask the question and know that we were getting something like a reasonable answer. And I think that was actually a really useful sort of thing to be doing, especially in an ed tech environment where so much is just done off the cuff. And I'm going to talk about that. So this isn't a presentation of a new technology. This isn't a presentation of research results. This isn't a presentation of the topic of the day. It's more a presentation of what would it take to talk usefully about some of these technologies that we're working on. Oh, arrow does not work. Okay. So, let us welcome, remember it's a baby shower theme, new technology to the world. What could go wrong? Okay. Let's look at the question first. And I'll confess as well. I may as well confess. I'm in a confessional mood today. The bulk of this presentation is organized around the text of an email that I wrote in response to one of my colleagues sending me this question: why do digital transformations fail? He sent it to me by email while I was working at home. Although, of course, the big push has been to get us all back into the office, because that's where we have collaboration and culture and all of that sort of stuff. But I don't want to go off on that tangent. Just be aware it exists in the back of my mind. So, the big question then, why do digital transformations fail? And part of the thing to think about is, what is a digital transformation? So like I say, it comes from the corporate side of the house. Sure, it would equally well, of course, apply to colleges and universities and even schools, etc., but we don't hear it expressed so much in those terms, in those environments. Well, Accenture. Digital transformation is the process by which companies, it's always companies, embed technologies across their business to drive fundamental change. So that's kind of interesting. The intent there is to drive change. The technology is the change agent. IBM. Digital transformation means adopting digital first customer, business partner, and employee experiences. So here, the transformation is to create these digital experiences, and we don't know what the change agent is. Wikipedia, because why not? Digital transformation is the adoption of digital technology by an organization to digitize non-digital products, services, or operations. Okay. Gartner. Digital transformation can refer to anything from IT modernization, for example, cloud computing, to digital optimization, to the invention of new digital business models. So, two big themes, right? The one theme is digitization. The other theme is change, right? New business models, new products, new experiences, etc. Now, we've been up to this enterprise of working in a digital world. Well, I've been doing it since, when did I first start? 1981. I've been doing online stuff since about 1990. So you'd think by now everything that could be digitalized has been digitized. Um, but of course, that's not true, as we're seeing with artificial intelligence. There are some things that we thought would resist digitization that are now becoming digitized. But we're also experiencing this transition from one wave of digitization to another to another. For example, going from the learning management system to the learning experience platform to whatever follows that. It'll be something. We'll talk about that. Okay, so how did we get here? And by here now, I mean, how did we get to talking about this sort of topic in the realm of learning and development in educational technology? Well, I've got three major lines of thought in my recent work, some of which some of you will have seen already. One of which was Web 3, which I actually presented to CNIE back in 2019. I called it e-learning 3.0. Then people came along and called it all Web 3. So then I started calling it Ed 3. None of my names caught on because they don't. So that's one thread. And that was a range of technologies, including cloud, including data, including the idea of community as consensus, the idea of automated assessment. Your next credential will be a job offer, things like that. Whole range of new technologies. It was a lot of fun to talk about those. And we're seeing all of those come on stream today in a big way. Second was AI ethics. I created a MOOC called Ethics, Analytics, and the Duty of Care. It got, I can't say dozens because that would imply more than one dozen, a number of people participating. I presented it in a few talks. I did a few workshops on it. I put up the MOOC online. It was a ton of work. I covered a lot of ground. For me, it was an enormously useful exercise, and it laid clear to me the complexity that is the subject of ethics in artificial intelligence. And when somebody says, comes along and says, "Oh yeah, we should look at the ethics of ChatGPT," either they're about to embark in, well, let's put it this way. I did all the presentations in that course. I did the transcripts of those and the slides of those. In both cases, the transcripts came out to be 1,000-word document, or 1,000-page document, and there were 1,000 pages of slides. So it's not as simple, let's just assume we've got the ethics figured out and all we have to do is implement them. It's not even remotely that simple. Third thing was data literacy. And actually this came up in the earlier discussion, I think Saul's discussion, the whole concept of, we're talking about digital literacy. What do we need to learn? How do we learn what we need to learn? How do we organize our learning if we're in a new field? In the past, I've talked about a thing called critical literacies, which basically interprets learning in any discipline as an exercise in pattern recognition. And then in data literacy, I took the basic categories of critical literacy, applied them to data literacy, and mapped them out. Long story short. Anyhow, it's another MOOC, and all the information is there for you to see. So all of these things are lurking in the background for me. Then there's the question of how we got here now, this year, at this moment. And the three things, first of all, just wrapping up my work on the tech guide, how to put up online learning quickly, easily, and inexpensively, which I did for the coronavirus, which was very popular, a lot more popular than I thought it would be or that it deserved to be. Also, the whole question of the Fediverse, I started working on that. Well, I've been on the Fediverse since 2016, but I did a presentation on it a year and a half or so ago, before the fallout with Twitter and he who shall not be named, etc. But the interesting question here is, how do we have a distributed federated learning network? It's interesting. We've seen just a little while ago, in English, adjectives have a specific order. But what is the order when you're saying distributed federated learning network? Is that the right order, or should it be a federated distributed? Anyhow, I worry about things like that. And then, of course, the barriers work that I did with DRDC. And actually, this accumulates a number of years worth of work with that organization, looking at digital literacy, looking at training methodologies, etc. There's a whole side to my life at NRC that doesn't show up in my newsletter. But it always has an influence in what I have to say. So, the big thing, I think, for me, coming out of all of this work is an understanding, I want to say like a sophisticated understanding or something like that, but I don't want to, make it seem like nobody else knows this, because I'm sure that's not true. But an understanding of what all this new tech does. And there are the three major technologies. And it's interesting for me, the e-learning 3.0 work that I did specifically did not name any of these three technologies. My argument at the time was and is, even back in 2019, they already exist. They're already a thing. And that's the funniest thing about this whole artificial intelligence thing from this year. People are acting like, oh, this just happened. I've been working at NRC for 22 years now, and for all of those 22 years, there has been at least one, and often more than one, research team working on artificial intelligence. And those research teams go back a long ways. This is not a things suddenly happened phenomenon. This is there's been a lot of work done by a lot of people over a very long time, and now, despite all the skeptics, and there have been many skeptics, it's beginning to show that it actually might work. Anyhow, so we could talk a lot about what ChatGPT does and doesn't do, whether it will create robot teachers or anything like that. But I think that is far too narrow a scope, as I think Sarah said. There's a lot more out there than just ChatGPT. There's the thing on my phone doing the transcript. There's the AI, the Topaz AI I use to get rid of all the speckle in my photographs. Oh, I love that. And there's more. I did a blog post just recently listing all the different ways I've been using AI without mentioning ChatGPT once. But what I've done here is to show how these three major technologies are all going to come together in a really interesting and important way. These three technologies are the metaverse, blockchain, and artificial intelligence. And what I think is interesting is there's kind of like a brand name for each one of them. For the metaverse, people are thinking virtual reality, right? Oculus Rift, Meta, the company, Mark Zuckerberg. For blockchain, everybody goes right away to Bitcoin, or if they're more sophisticated, Ethereum. And then, of course, artificial intelligence, ChatGPT, or if they're in the know, Bard. But underneath each of these technologies is a whole range of other technologies. The metaverse is interesting not because it creates immersive digital worlds. I mean, that technology, as people have pointed out, again, has been around for decades. I remember way back in the early 2000s playing around with active worlds. No, what the metaverse does that's different and new is to create persistent objects, specifically persistent digital objects, but also object persistence from the real world, because you have mixed reality, right? From the real world into a virtual world. That was not a trivial problem. I remember working in multi-user dungeons back in the 1990s. In fact, one of the very first things I did with the Canadian Association for Distance Education with some of my colleagues was to have a CADE conference in our multi-user dungeon. As far as I know, that was the world's first. The transcripts are still on my website. And the big question of multi-user dungeons was, how do you have persistence? How do you migrate this persistence from one mud to another mud? Because everybody wanted inter-mud, right? Because that would be cool. You could go from one mud to another mud and keep your sword and all your money. Except the other mud was a space mud, so that didn't make a whole lot of sense. And how would we do the currency valuations and so on? It was a horrible mess. But there was an inter-mud communications relay created. That was pretty interesting. Blockchain again. Yeah, sure, the financial services jumped all over blockchain, and it became a world of scams and things. That tells me more about financial services than it does about the technology. What's really important about the technology is it's a persistent, tamper-free database mechanism, distributed database mechanism based on things like content addressing, Merkle graphs, and consensus. I won't talk about the technology behind those, but blockchain is what guarantees the authenticity of the persistent objects that are described in the metaverse. The metaverse is where we work with them on an everyday basis. The blockchain is the tech that makes sure what we think is real is real. And then this all ties into artificial intelligence. What we have now are large language models, and everybody's going gaga over them. What large language models have done is learn how words are arranged in sequences. And that's about it. And that's all that they intended to do, because they didn't need to do anything else. And just as an aside, it's sort of funny to see newspapers saying, you're stealing our content, right? All these AI systems are doing, all they're recording is the arrangement of words. They're not recording facts. It's not recording data. It's not recording information. It's recording the order of words. And if that's the IP that all of these organizations are trying to say we own, that's a really slim footing to be trying to hold. But what it is doing is it's learning language. And language is an incredibly valuable tool. And if you want your language to actually mean things, it's going to have to refer back to objects in some way. And there's a whole lot of philosophical stuff I won't go into when we talk about what does it mean for an AI to refer to objects. For our purposes here, what it means is the AI, via the blockchain, refers to the persistent objects described in the metaverse. And I could bracket the metaverse and say, that includes all of the semantic web. The metaverse is a way of doing the semantic web, except with persistence and so on. These things all work together, and that's what the new tech does. So I shake my head sometimes when I hear, certainly when I see many of the recent AI experts come along and say, offer a college course on writing chat GPT prompts. And I sort of go, well, okay, there's one born every minute, I guess. Anyhow. So how do we think about all of this? I mean, this is a huge transformation any way you look at it. It's a huge transformation from the point of view of everybody's going from whatever it was they were doing before to whatever it is we're going to be doing after. It's a huge transformation in the sense of, uh, there's going to be a lot of change. Here are a bunch of new things we never thought we could do that now we can do. Like robot teachers, for example. And, George Siemens wrote just no, not George Siemens, Doug Belshaw wrote just the other day about Moore's 2 sigma problem. How do we get massive, or at least cohort-sized training to get to the same educational level as the one tutor, one student model? Well, you make one of those two entities a robot. And hint, it's not the student. Robot teachers. And then everybody can have the benefits of individualized tutoring. But, robot tutoring is a lot more than, say, programmed instruction, decision trees, content recommendations, learning analytics, or any of the stuff that passes for AI today. So how do we think about that? Well, that's what this work was about that I was doing. The SAMR model, substitution, augmentation, modification, redefinition. It's interesting. There's a history to that. On the Taylor Institute page, it's credited. But the SAMR model is actually an old model. It had its origination as a description of what happened as a new technology diffused through an environment or society. So it was observational at first. Later on, it became normative, which is really strange. It's because, when people simply observed, okay, here's what happens when a new technology comes along. First, they use it to just substitute for what they're already doing. Then they make it a bit better. Then they begin to make changes, and then they redefine everything they were doing with this new technology. That's just what happens. And it was turned around and we were told, no, this is how you should introduce a new technology to an environment. And I look at that and I say, so do what they were going to do anyways. Personally, I prefer to go straight to R without all the agony of S, A, and M. But, it's really hard to do that. It's not impossible, though. And we'll talk a bit about that as well. On the same page is something called TPAC, Technological Pedagogical Content Knowledge model. And of course, it's a combination of the three things, right? Technological knowledge, pedagogical knowledge, and content knowledge. There's the presumption that we have all three of those knowledges. I would question that quite a bit, actually. But it's popular, and it's a way for people to represent the different sorts of things you need to know when you're thinking about how a new technology would take hold, especially in a digital learning environment. Okay. Of course, if you have robot tutors, why do you need pedagogical knowledge anymore? Well, life's mysteries. We looked at three approaches that are more common in the business environment. And again, some of you, probably all of you, will be familiar with these, but we don't really see them raised a whole lot, if at all, at an education technology conference, unless it's a corporate education technology conference, in which case, especially if it's sponsored by McKinsey or the World Bank or something like that, in which case that's the entire conference. But I wanted to look at these. We use these as a basis for evaluating the sorts of things that we would have to ask about in order to determine why or why not instructional technology was adopted. So there's the whole technology acceptance field. And basically, this is a range of models that were developed over time. We begin with Rogers' innovation diffusion theory. And it's interesting. You go into the background of that and you read through that. And this stuff is actually fairly old. It's fairly old. It's really old. But yeah, I don't have the date here in my notes, sadly. But it comes from an idea that technology diffusion can be thought of as analogous to diffusion in general. And in fact, that's why they called it diffusion theory. In physics, and in fact, this is the point on which my career as a physicist foundered. It was precisely at this point, doing the mathematics of diffusion of one liquid in another liquid. So diffusion of two liquids in a solution. And apparently you can do the mathematics of that. Well, they can do the mathematics of that. I could not do the mathematics of that, and I realized at that time that I was not going to be a physicist. I could probably go back and do it now. I know so much more than I did in 1980. But what's interesting is that it's a mathematical process. You put one liquid in another liquid, and it just happens. And so they thought, well, you take a technology, you put it in an environment, it just happens. And, it's funny. There's so much criticism in the educational world about, tech inevitabilityism or even tech solutionism. And it's all pushback against that sort of thinking, that it's like pouring one liquid into another and it just happens naturally. And I can see why they said that, because you can't not get a result if you dump technology into an environment. You try it, right? Virtually no matter what technology and what environment you mix, there's going to be something happening. And the question was, can we understand what's going to happen? And the same thing with technology and learning, right? If you apply a technology, say blackboards, to an environment, say schools, they might just sit there for a while, but eventually one of the teachers is going to go, scritch, scritch, scritch. And, oh, yeah, I can use that. So, yeah, there is something to that. But it was all very too mechanical. And so... And it wasn't just diffusion. So we come along with the theory of planned behavior. It's not quite behaviorism because there's planning. This is Ozgen's theory. But the idea is that the person's intention to act is the immediate determination of that action. So in other words, the idea was, for technology diffusion, you explain the diffusion, or shall we say the use, of a technology in an environment in terms of the person's intention to use that technology. Which is also kind of useful, also kind of not useful, because what creates that person's intention? Well, there we get the technology acceptance model, which is based in attitudes. You notice how we're becoming less and less deterministic, less and less linear, less and less mathematically based. I find that really interesting in the history of this. So, so consider attitudes rather than behavioral intentions as the main predictor of behavior. What sort of attitudes? Well, for example, do you fear technology? Do you have hope for the future? Things like that. There's also the concerns-based adoption model. So, which, according to Straub, technology adoption is a complex, inherently social, developmental process. Sounds a lot like Vygotsky. Sounds a lot like social constructivism, and there is an awful lot of overlap. And then finally, they came up with the Unified Theory of Acceptance and Use of Technology, or UTAUT. It's not on the slide. And then, of course, because you couldn't just leave it, they came out with a UTaught 2. And so these were basically based on performance expectancy, effort expectancy, social influence. That was the death of Google Glass, right? Was the nerd factor. And then the intention and the facilitating conditions. So all of these things come into play when we're talking about whether a technology will be used in education. Let's bracket that for a second. Remember, what we're talking about here is stuff like AI, blockchain, metaverse, I would add Fediverse, Web3, etc. Okay. The second approach is risk management. I won't spend as long on it, but basically risk management, which you cannot do a tech project in government without, and to a large degree corporate environments without this either, although in education it appears to be very optional. The Fine-Kinney method was the origin of risk management theory, and what they did is consider three factors: the exposure to the risk, how much would it impact you if it were to happen, the likelihood of the risk, how likely is it to happen, and then the consequence. If it happens, how many people will die? Okay, maybe not that, but you know what I mean, right? They combined the exposure and likelihood and created a risk matrix. And the risk matrix creates one of these little diagrams here that we see, the little box. I'm pointing to my screen. The little boxes with the green, which is minimal risk, and the red, which is high risk. And the idea is you go through a risk analysis, consider all the possible risks that might come up, run it through this calculation, and then that's your risk calculation. And then in an ideal world, you describe what you're going to do to mitigate all of those risks. And that's interesting. And we can take it a step further by producing what is called an analytical hierarchy process model, where we're not just looking at risk generically for an entire project or an entire technology, but what you do is you take all the possible risks, you break them down into a hierarchy of different topics or different aspects of the project. You analyze the risks for each one of those, and then you run them through a calculation which rolls them all up. There's a long mathematical formula with one of those E's at the beginning. And that gives you your overall risk rating. So the analytical hierarchy process model kind of fits pretty well with the concerns-based adoption model, in the sense that for a given technology, we're looking at a range of different factors. The social, the technological, the legal, etc. We'll come back to that. Finally, validation protocols, which I won't, you guys probably know them mostly, but what I want to say here is that all of these theories, unlike so much in education, are actually run through a process much like the process that we ran. So we did or created our own study instrument based on technology acceptance and risk management, and did some modifications to that. And then my work was to run it through these validation protocols to assess whether the instrument that was being produced was a valid, that is to say, both valid and reliable instrument to identify why instructors weren't using technology. So like I say, no results, but that was the method. Thought you might be interested in that. So the big question here, and this is the turning point in the talk, what did I learn from all of this? Because that's what you're here for, right? Well, I hope you're here for that. Okay. So, first of all, we can come up with kind of a risk registry. And the risk registry, as I mentioned, is what we get when we combine the concerns-based model with the risk assessment model. So this is based on a paper by Pat Reed in 2014. I've done a nice registry modeled because it's a baby shower theme model for it. So basically 5 major factors or areas of concern: technology, process, administration, environment, and faculty. I always found it interesting that students aren't in there, but we'll leave that aside for now. And then in each of them, so, the sorts of factors that would impact whether technology is used: access, reliability, complexity. Process would include management, support, and professional development. Administration, environment, and faculty, etc. You can read those for yourselves. And it is a nice model. I'm not sure how complete a model it is. It's complete enough for a corporate environment. I think that in a more open environment, we'd probably want to include some more factors. But it's a good enough model that we can actually draw a pretty good assessment of whether or not a digital transformation initiative will succeed or fail. I mean, if we can answer positively in all of those areas, probably it would succeed. But if we identify huge areas of concern in some of these, they're red on the risk matrix, then there's a really good chance that they'll fail. Coffee. Okay. But wait. What do we mean by fail? That's the question that they don't ask over on the corporate side, because they know what they mean. And these are from Roan 2022. If you download the slides, you'll find the reference in the notes. So Hershey's fast-tracked a tech rollout, didn't test it properly, lost $100 million worth of orders that they could have fulfilled. And I think of all that wasted chocolate and my heart bleeds. Hewlett Packard, 2003, new ERP was not configured to sync with the old system. And so, again, orders went unfulfilled, cost them $160 million. Miller Coors, same sort of thing. They had a $100 million tech transformation project that was oversold and underdelivered, dragged on for 3 years, never did finish, and the company basically gave up and sued their implementation team. Revlon lost $64 million in unshipped orders, etc. So that's what fail looks like in the corporate environment. Of course, that kind of fail is meaningless to us, right? Because, except in a very broad sense, we're not worried about share price or unshipped orders, except for those of us who are, in the corporate learning environment, in which case it matters a lot. But even those in the corporate learning environment will, I think, recognize that there's a broader sense of fail at work here. I thought I'd look up some other kinds of failure, just for fun. The Zune was a failure. Sony Betamax was a failure. BlackBerry Storm, which was basically the end of BlackBerry. Theranos. Turns out that manipulating your results and pushing non-working products to market, that results in failure. Merck's Vioxx, increased risk of cardiovascular events. That's failure. Ford Pinto was a failure, an explosive failure. McDonald's McDLT which by all accounts was one of McDonald's better hamburgers, but it was packaged in two separate containers. Wasteful, so wasteful. And of course, Google Glass, which I mentioned earlier, never did get past the nerdiness factor. So there's a broad scope of what we mean by succeed or fail. And this is the sort of thing that I encountered a lot when I was doing the ethics of artificial intelligence. People are so worried about a few very specific ways that artificial intelligence can fail, and they don't, first of all, don't look at what it can do, and many of the skeptics don't, by no means all of them. But more to the point, they don't consider the wide range of what could possibly count as a failure. And even the question of whether what they count as a failure is a failure. And that's, I really like Sarah's talk, because basically she took the idea of it allowing students to cheat. Oh, that's a failure. She turned that around and said, well, no, it means we'll just get past this stage in our development as educators, which I think is exactly the right approach to take. And that's the important thing. Failure doesn't just mean people are not using the technology, even though in a lot of boardrooms that seems to be what it is. Minimally, success means more than simply people are using the technology. Success minimally means people are using the technology and not getting killed. Or at least people are using the technology, not getting killed, and getting some benefit from it. You see what I mean? Like, it's not just whether you use the technology or not that is success or failure. Even if the whole world is using ChatGPT, that's not the determinant of whether ChatGPT is a success or a failure. Look, the whole world is using Facebook. From this pure corporate perspective, yeah, Facebook is a huge success. But there are other factors involved as to whether we think of Facebook as a success or a failure. But anyhow, even let's go back to the question of whether or not people use the technology. Because, ultimately what people decide does have some bearing on this. Not as much as we'd think, but it does. When people don't use a new technology, there's often a very good reason for that. Although, sometimes people use the technology when they really should not have. And yeah, there are lots of examples of that we can think of. So, we'll do a little rapid version here. Here's how new technology will fail. My version. So, first reason. Nobody knows what the new tech does. Remember a bunch of slides earlier? I had a slide that said, here's what the new tech does. For the most part, nobody knows that. They think that ChatGPT gives them answers to questions, for example. They think that blockchain is used for digital currencies, and that's where it begins and ends. They think the metaverse is Oculus Rift. But these technologies are a combination of a range of underlying technologies. And when they're brought together, and then when these major technologies are brought together, we get something really interesting and complex. So much so that it's not really possible to say what's going on inside it. And it's not just neural networks that are like that, although, let's be clear, neural networks are like that. We can't actually say what technology is doing in our society. I know there's an awful lot of technology experts out there who give us nice statements about this tech does this tech does that, this tech does that. But that's a very simplistic understanding of what a technology does. Look at a car. What does a car do? A car transports people. If you think that's what a car does, and that's the beginning and the end of the story, you don't understand a car. You don't understand it as a delivery vehicle. You don't understand it as a status symbol. You don't understand it as a rite of passage, etc., etc. And all of this applies to all of these technologies. So there isn't going to be a simple story. And nobody can give you that story. The best we can do is, well, as Samuel Arbsman says, we can kind of interpret what's happening, a bit like TV meteorologists. And that's a really good example because the phenomenon is exactly the same. When people ask you to explain what an AI is doing, even now with a large language model, it's got 1 billion inputs. You can't tell me what it's doing. Nobody can. The best you can do is some kind of interpretation. But we have to be careful not to mistake the interpretation for the fact. We've already done that with the brain. We interpret what a human brain is doing, and we come up with all kinds of concepts that may or may not apply. Do people really have beliefs? Do people really have souls? We make up these ways of characterizing what's happening, but what's actually happening is many levels further down and a lot more complex than people realize. If you don't know what the new tech's doing, it's really hard to adopt it. That's why we need people who are able to kind of describe, like a TV meteorologist, what a new tech is doing. That's what I'm trying to do here a bit. Another reason why the tech fails is the new tech is harder to use than the old tech. And here we go back to the BlackBerry Storm again. But I'm thinking even of, what was it I was thinking of? Like passwords. Okay, passwords are a real pain, and we'd all like to get rid of them. But every single replacement for passwords that has come along is way harder to use than a password. The two-factor authentication, the special program in your computer that you use for your two-factor authentication, the soft keys, the SSL keys, etc. It's really hard to use. And you're just trying to do the same thing that you were doing with something that already worked. And that leads to the next point. The new tech is being used to do the exact same thing as the old tech, which the old tech did fine, but the new tech takes longer and adds extra steps. This is the classic, we have a new technology, let's create a classroom in it. And here we have a VR version of a classroom with avatars, which interestingly have only heads and hands but no bodies, except the teacher who has a body but no legs. And the teacher is writing, can you see that? Writing on a whiteboard. Why would we do that? What's going to convince people that this kind of technology is better than a classroom for bringing people together? Yeah, no wonder people said, yeah, we need to get back to in-person learning again, because remote learning looked sometimes like this. There may be other unexpected side effects of the new technology. These side effects might be directly related to the technology, as in the case of the nuclear bomb, or they may be indirectly related to the technology, but represent in their own unique way a worst case scenario. For example, a heavily centralized social media network that is used to share news and information among journalists and activists around the world being taken over by someone with zero tolerance for journalists and activists. No names. Um, you have to put that in your risk matrix, right? Uh, you know, what if someone who was not you ends up in control of your technology? Um, I forget his name. It's Sam Altman, the guy who runs ChatGPT or OpenAI. I'm sorry, I forget his name. I have Sam Watterson on the brain, but that's Law and Order, which is also related, but I digress. Came out with an article that I ran in my newsletter the other day, like a day or two ago, calling for AI to be regulated, where regulation meant the companies would get together, come up with a regulatory framework that leading governments, not all, just leading governments around the world would endorse. And that sounded great. I applied the what if we get one of these tests to it and realized that we probably don't want them regulating their own technology, and made that comment. But it was interesting. The very next day, the European Union came out with a framework that they said should be applied to things like OpenAI and Sam Altman. I hate having a dyslexic memory. His first reaction was, well, following those regulations would not be feasible. If we had to follow those regulations, we'd just have to shut down. So, yeah. Regulations? This is a very common one. I'm working on a new project, which I'll talk about sometime in the future. And this is the biggest concern for me. The new tech doesn't address actual needs. And I want to be clear here what I mean by that. Actual needs. I don't mean the needs of the people who created the technology. I don't even mean the needs of the people who paid for the technology. That now characterizes, by the way, more than 90% of all educational technology. No, I mean the needs of the people who are intended to use the technology. This is really important. More important than you can imagine, because there are two things that fall out of this. First, if the technology doesn't actually address the user's needs, there's virtually nothing you can do to get them to use the technology, let alone use it safely, carefully, properly, as intended, etc. Second, if the technology does address users' actual needs, there's virtually nothing you can do to stop them from using it. See, tech diffusion is a thing, after all. It's just a different thing that people thought, right? If a technology is actually going to serve a need, it's like a better mousetrap. People will beat a path to your door. It's funny. You think about the smartphone. The smartphone became widely diffused throughout the Government of Canada workforce. Everyone has one. Well, maybe not everyone, but everyone I know has one. Everyone they know has one. There are tens of thousands, more than 100,000, probably almost 170,000 smartphones in the Canadian civil service. All of them were actually bought by the people who used them. The government, for the most part, didn't pay for them at all. In fact, the government supported BlackBerry and fostered that program for a while. But the smartphone, unencumbered, was so useful. People would buy their own and actually carry two smartphones around so that they could have a proper smartphone. That's how useful it was. And so the technology adoption plan in the government became, how do we make it so that these smartphones can actually work for people? And they're still struggling with that to this day because, of course, the government has security needs, it has safety needs, etc. And a lot of these guarantees aren't built into smartphone technology because, well, we go back to this problem. Another problem, the new tech is unreliable and glitchy. That's what happened to the government's BlackBerry plan, part of what happened to it. And we've all seen these things, right? The blue screen of death, the zip disk click of death. That probably predates many of you, so maybe look that one up. It's quite funny. I had a zip disk once. And yeah, it went click, 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 clunk. But the big one, of course, is bandwidth and slow internet. My office is a Wi-Fi dead zone. So, yeah, they're not able to get me to use Wi-Fi in my office. Big surprise. I have a whole range of experiences with unreliable and glitchy technology, and I've collected some of those experiences in a playlist called Stephen Follows Instructions, where I try to use a new technology following the instructions that were provided with that technology with hilarious results. Another failure vector. The new tech was a lot more expensive and had to be rationed or partially deployed. That was the other thing with the government's mobile phone initiative. They only give them to managers, but the people who really needed them were the people who were out in the field. The managers could talk to each other, but they didn't really have any way of communicating with their staff, and so none of this was particularly useful. Although when they traveled to conferences, they did have their phones and they could call their office again. So I guess there's that. Today we're seeing it with VR headsets, things like the HoloLens and so on, horribly overpriced. It's not something that you could widely deploy. It was the same in the earlier days of computers in education. And they still use this kind of picture to this day, where you have one computer, a person, usually a boy, working with the computer, and 3 or 4 people standing behind the boy. The girl, another girl, and the black boy, and maybe a teacher in the back. And that was the model, right? Terrible. And I always said, a computer is first and foremost a personal device. And I maintain that to this day. Your education is first and foremost a personal thing. AI, when it really comes on stream, will be first and foremost a personal service. We'll have our own AIs. Forget about GPT. Wait till we get our own personal AIs. I have one. I use it. It's on Feedly, my RSS reader. It's called Leo. I have my own instance of Leo. I train it myself. It works really well. That's the game changer. Here's one that you're all pretty familiar with. The new tech was creepy, and tracked everyone's every move. And this could be everything from video surveillance to red light cameras to key loggers to your computer is being monitored for service considerations or whatever. People don't want every move to be monitored. And if you are monitoring their every move, especially if it's going to affect their pay or their standing in the company, they're probably not going to want to use that technology because they can reliably predict the bad consequences that will follow. So, just about to wrap up because I know it's kind of getting on time. So I had another 8 slides talking about causes. I combined them into one slide. And, these are the obvious things, right? These aren't the reasons why tech fails, but these are the things that create the reasons why tech fails. So they didn't consult, they didn't pilot, they didn't market or introduce the technology, they did not conduct a risk assessment. I still think nobody's conducted a ChatGPT risk assessment, even among the critics, not a proper one. Proper budgeting and investment was not done. Think Twitter there, right? Business processes never adapted to match the capabilities of the new tech. They kept doing the same old thing. They kept reproducing classrooms. They kept reproducing lessons. They kept thinking that learning is about remembering stuff. And then finally, a culture of trust was never established. The people who used the technology never did trust the people who required the technology. And of course, you're not going to get good, successful transformation out of that. So these are the reasons. These are not the reasons why tech transformation fail. Although I see this accounted as reasons a lot, so much I made a special slide for it. This is not why transformation fails. Staff and student resistance to change, fear of losing our jobs, or the speed of change. No, you're blaming the user here. And again, if the technology has any value to the user, they're going to use it. So it's not simply that, oh, they're afraid of change. I hate that kind of remark because it's so not true. Look at all the change we've had in society over the last decades. We, staff, students, everyone, have accommodated so much change. It is ridiculous to say we're resistant to change. Nobody in their rational mind could say that. Second thing, human resources, lack of training, not having the right talent, insufficient leadership. Again, none of these is necessary to make a technology succeed. Look at, what was it that just came out? Zelda. Something about Zelda. It was a big game. I don't play it. I play No Man's Sky. But The Legend of Zelda. Nobody's being trained to play that. We don't need to have the right game playing talent in order to make this a success. The people buying it, and I went to Rideau Mall, and they were lined up down the hall and around the corner when this came out, the morning this came out. There were no leaders telling them to line up. They didn't need leaders. So, no, it's none of this stuff. And then the horrible psychology theories that get trotted out so frequently in education, not having the right mindset, not having a growth mindset, failure to innovate, failure to understand innovation, failure to disrupt, etc., etc. None of that has anything to do with this. Maybe one or two outliers might just not want to, ever change anything ever again. But mostly, again, has nothing to do with the psychology of the people using the tech. It really does have to do with the tech and how useful it is to the people using the tech. My one final note is the example I gave earlier. Look at what everybody has been doing with the mobile phone. Huge tech transformation. We paid for them ourselves. Mostly we trained ourselves. The phones just worked, mostly. And they made a lot of things. A ton of things, like, say, instantly creating a transcript of this talk, a lot easier to do. They were so useful, we went out and spent our own money so that we could use them at work. So that's the context in which we should be viewing all of this AI / blockchain / metaverse stuff. We're so worried about What will other people do? They might do the wrong thing. They might act unethically. Oh no, people might lose their jobs. Oh, copyright, plagiarism. None of that stuff is relevant. All of this, you know, well, we have a word for it in the open source community: fear, uncertainty, doubt. That's what's being played out right now with respect to these technologies. And I wish I had another hour to continue on just analyzing that into its finest details, but I don't, so I can't. This is the kind of analysis we should be doing, not the scaremongering, let's get the ethics right kind of analysis. Because we don't have ethics right anyways. We've been working on ethics for 3,000 years. We still haven't figured it out. So we're not going to get it in the next 2 or 3 months. So let's think about these technologies as technologies, and let's understand whether or not they're successful or whether they fail by thinking of them and understanding them as technologies and not the moral quandary of the millennium. Thank you. Little XO, because this is, after all, a baby shower template. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for a very intriguing final presentation for the 2023 CNIE annual conference. Lots of food for thought there. We are past the top of the hour, but I mean, how can we pass up this opportunity if anybody has some questions for Stephen as a follow-up to that presentation? If anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask or thoughts they'd like to share? Don't be shy if you do have any questions. You grab the mic and jump in.
I actually went down a rabbit hole yesterday, in fact, looking up that the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. Because it was misquoted in a newsletter that I read. The future is already here. It's just not widely distributed, was the misquote. But I wanted to check, and of course, Gibson never actually wrote it, but he did say it many times. And it is his quote, and it's a real quote. That was an
I
hour
love
well
the meme
spent.
you shared earlier too. I love the meme you shared earlier in your presentation too about how we have pretty much the power of all of human knowledge in our pockets, but we use it to share pictures of cats and argue with people on the internet.
Yep.
I used to have that meme on my office door a few years ago. We have a couple of hands up. Sarah, I think was first, and we'll go to Carol and Ray.
Yeah, thanks so much for the excellent presentation. I found it really engaging. And I really appreciated how you brought back the SAMR and TPAC models that have been around for what seems like decades now. Maybe it's not quite decades, but they seem to have been sort of fossilized. And I was interested in your opinions on how we could present those in kind of a fresh, new way, say to early career educators, grad students, so like the next generation can still draw value from them and they don't kind of seem stale. I don't think they're stale, but what do you think?
I didn't build this presentation around them. I did mention them because I thought they were relevant and should be included because they form the background of thinking on this topic. So I would probably approach the topic with something like UTOT or UTOT 2, and or I really did like the breakdown that was done by Pat Reed, because that combines the two sides, the risk management and the technology acceptance of various variables, combines them quite well. That's the approach I would take, is to use something like Reed's model, and probably I'd be inclined to extend it to take it outside of corporate context.
That's helpful. Thanks. I see there's other people in the queue, so I'll end there. Thank you.
Carol, I think you had your hand up next, and then we'll go to Ray.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. I'm delighted that we managed to get to stay through and get to the end. It was held in great suspense for as we were going through. I was also attending accessibility conference at the University of Guelph, and I just want to see if we can draw any connection between the problem of accessibility, the problem of inaccessibility for those with disabilities to use online materials. One of our speakers, I wish I could remember the name, had been asked to review the AODA legislation. Richard, anyway, he said everything I write, he said, has to be in an accessible document. He said, like, why can't we just ask AI? And maybe this is a question for Sarah as well. Why can't we just ask AI to make this document accessible instead of, So accessibility in online materials,
Yeah.
Any comment on how we might make that transformation? I guess when there's a small group that need something, so it's not necessarily the user of the technology that is the one who, unless it happens automatically, but we need to support the people who need it, who are not necessarily always the users. And even sometimes they are, and it's hard. Okay, I'll stop.
Yeah, that's quite right. People have, to my mind, undervalued the capability of technology in general and AI type technologies in particular to achieve greater efficiencies and cost savings. And someone like me comes along and says, greater efficiencies and cost savings. People go, capitalism, right? And okay, I get that. But when we're talking about providing a service to a group of people, especially a small demographic that isn't going to be able to, as a group, pay for large, expensive technologies because there just aren't enough of them, then these things really do come into play, obviously. That's why I was willing. I actually paid for my own phone. And it's a backup for corporate tech. And believe me, it has been. I had to go back to the office starting in March. My computers still don't work properly. But this always has. Even in the Wi-Fi dead zone, because I have it's a mobile phone. But that's why I bought a Pixel phone specifically. My first was a Pixel 4, and now I have this one, because it would transcribe my talks. And I had always wanted to transcribe my talks because people who are unable to hear weren't able to get any benefit out of them because they're audio, right? And I personally love audio. Audio is my favorite medium. But if you can't hear, audio's a terrible medium. So I've been using this. I've been posting the transcripts on my presentation page. And it takes me, it took the small investment in this phone, which I was going to buy anyways. It takes me approximately, I've done it a few times, 3 or 4 minutes to get the text from Google Docs, which is where it ends up, to my specific presentation page. I still do that manually because I'm stupid. But 3 or 4 minutes, and now I've made my talk accessible to people who are hard of hearing. That's what we should be thinking, right? Otherwise, the problem of providing accessible resources is intractable. and it has been for a long time, and it creates actual other barriers. You think of the ADA in the United States, um, requiring one of the University of California institutions, I forget which one, to take down their open access learning materials because they weren't ADA compliant. Well, that's not a step forward. I totally get the concerns that these materials should be accessible. I totally agree that these materials should be accessible. But the way to reach that isn't to require things that aren't accessible to be taken down. The way to reach that is to figure out better, cheaper, and more efficient ways of making the resources that already exist accessible to everyone else. We have the same problem in the federal government in Canada of translation. And I've been working with some European groups recently. Boy, we thought we had a problem with translation. And again, there's this rule that anything that gets posted on the Government of Canada website has to be in English and French. There are really good reasons for that, and I totally support that. I'm 100% behind the principle of bilingualism, and indeed, I would extend it further. I think it should include indigenous languages, obviously, especially in the north, but really across the country. I think it should support languages of significant minority populations. But the cost, it's like really expensive inside the government to translate a document. Like, now, fortunately, it's always someone else's budget, but still, you're sitting there, it's the taxpayers' money, and you're going, I can't imagine we're spending this amount of money to translate a document. And there's been a lot of resistance over the years to using automated translation in government. Now, at first, for some very good reasons, right? It was awful. But automated translation now is getting so good that there's less and less of a reason not to use it. And, even if it produces just a workable first draft of a translation, that should be at least enough to get us off the ground. That's the approach to take. I know I went on about this, but I've encountered this so many times. And I've always supported the principle of accessibility first, universal design for learning. I think all of those are great things. Tagging, image captioning. That's why I like Mastodon so much. It almost requires you to caption your image. But I'm sitting here thinking, I'm typing a description of an image that I'm looking at, like a chump. Why am I doing this? It's taking me longer to type out what's in the image than it took me to create the image. There is an AI that does that, but right now it's terrible. But when this is good, and that's not going to be long, I should just push a button, it'll produce the caption, I'll say, yeah, that's good, and continue from there.
Thank you. Yeah, I know it's an ongoing problem, and I don't know. They asked the keynote speaker a question, and he said, "Oh, well, good thing you didn't ask me like how to cure cancer." These unanswerable questions. So thank you for your input on it.
Yeah,
thank you.
Not unanswerable.
Thank you, Carol, for that question. Ray, you had your hand up from the beginning, so I'm going to give you the last word with the last question for Stephen here now, because we are getting close to halfway past the hour, and I don't want to keep people for too long because it is around the supper hour for a lot of us around the country, and I want you to be able to go and relax and enjoy the evening. And Stephen, you've been quite generous with your time here today. So Ray, last question, over to you.
Yeah, I'll just add that it's after midnight where I am. I actually sort of, in a spirit of provocation, Stephen, when you said we can't know what it's doing. I went out and asked it,
Yeah.
what is it doing? So I asked ChatGPT, what are you doing? And it said, I'm an AI language model here to assist and provide information on a wide range of topics. I don't have physical presence or the ability to do things in the traditional sense. My purpose is to answer questions, engage in conversations, and help users like you with any queries you might have. How can I assist you today?
Mm-hmm.
So then I asked it, how does ChatGPT work? And I got a different answer. I'm not going to read all of it because it's too long.
Yeah,
But-
that's wise.
ChatGPT, like other language models, is based on a deep learning architecture called GPT, Generative Pre-trained Transformer. Here's a simplified explanation of how it works, and it lists pre-training, transformer architecture, fine-tuning, response generation. There's a paragraph that describes each of those.
Yeah.
And then it ends up saying, it's important to note that while ChatGPT can provide helpful information, it may not always produce accurate or reliable answers.
Yeah.
It's always a good idea to verify information from reliable sources when necessary. And what I find interesting about that is that nowhere did it say what you said, Stephen, which is that it strings words together following a statistical analysis of what of what people say when they talk.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't say any of that. It in fact did what you said it doesn't do.
Okay. You could take the word of ChatGPT over me if you wanted. And that would be you're right. I mean, but you'd be wrong in my view. But let's answer that in a more diplomatic way. We know that ChatGPT is basically constructed. It's a deep learning system. It's basically built out of neural networks. A large number, I forget how many, but it's a lot. That were basically pre-trained by being fed a ton of data of actual examples of language use. And it was pre-trained in some specific ways, which are described in the name. Generative pre-trained transformer. We know that. Now, if we look at that, we can go all the way down to the bottom level, and this is where all of this stuff started for me, because the bottom level was the level when I was looking at this in the 1980s, and people like Geoffrey Hinton and what are their names? Romo Hart and McClellan and others were doing their groundbreaking work in neural networks. That level involves signals going from one unit to another, the adjustments of weights between that unit, the changing of the bias or sensitivity of the unit, maybe the creation of loops to create convolutional neural networks, etc. We could talk about that. At that level, at that basic level, that's what it's doing. Same with the human brain, right? Human brain, whole bunch of neurons. Signals go from one to another, one neuron to another, based on electrochemical potentials, spiking frequencies, the gap, etc. Not a useful level of description in either case. So what happens is we move up a layer of abstraction, and we've done that with both humans and with machines. And so we have in humans basic psychology, It might be, for example, a theory, well, much like we saw with you taught about attitudes and expectations and desires and goals. Or it might be a psychology that's a little more out there. Um, and I won't give examples, there's no need at this point, although I have my favorite whipping posts to complain about, which I do in my newsletter. Same thing with the neural networks. You move up the layers, we begin to describe what they're doing. And yeah, that's how we get language like ChatGPT is hallucinating, or ChatGPT is trying to give you an answer to a question. The thing is, the further you get away from that base layer, the more abstract your description has become, because you're using a single concept to represent a non-defined set of possible neural states in either the computer or the human. By non-defined, I mean that there's no way of drawing the set of all and only those states that correspond to whatever it is you just said that the thing is doing. So if you say ChatGPT intends to do such and such, that statement does not reduce to any set of statements about the neural net underneath. And that's important because that means that as you get higher and higher up, your statements become more and more abstract and less likely to be true. And worse, harder and harder to falsify. So when ChatGPT tells you in all earnestness, I'm trying to give you answers to questions that you have, it's not. Because there's no way to get from I'm trying to give you answers to here are some intermediate states down to here is what's happening at the neural level. There is no there, right? And it's not that it's lying, because, again, I mean, strictly speaking, it is lying because it's doing the same thing that humans do when they lie. But it's not that it's lying in the sense that it's giving its best shot at providing a higher level description of the incredibly complicated thing that's going on underneath. And it's just something that is probably an inaccurate generalization because it just doesn't have the data to work from. So that's how I would approach your sort of comment. And it bothers me. This is the takeaway from this and why I spent the time on it. People say, I'm not going to say that ChatGPT is thinking or hallucinating or intending or trying or anything like that. All I'm going to say is ChatGPT is generating. Except it's not even generating, right? It's just stringing sequences of words together. That is, that's a level of description, maybe one or two levels up from that basic neural structure thing. That's what it's doing. But there's no reason to talk like that. The reason why people talk like that is because they say, well, those are the things that humans do that ChatGPT doesn't do. But humans don't do that either, technically, right? Humans don't hallucinate, technically. They have these neural events and cascade phenomenon and floods of signals and at several layers up, we call that hallucination, even though it's not really hallucination, it's just this neural phenomenon. Well, that's what's happening in ChatGPT. It's this cascade of neural events that we call hallucinating because it resembles an awful lot what humans seem to be like when they hallucinate. So take that as you will, right? ChatGPT is trying. It doesn't have the experience to describe its own behavior properly, but that's okay. Neither do humans. I hope that was useful. I know it was long, but I hope it was useful.
I like that, but neither do humans. Good note to end things on. And I think we're always struggling to get the experience to describe what we're doing or what we need to be doing. And I think that this conference has been a tremendous help for some of us to make some of those leaps forward and to see some different perspectives on a range of different issues about future-proofing our use of technology and our design of learning for our own sakes and for our students' sakes. And what a great couple of presentations here this evening from Sarah and from Stephen to round things out. Two completely different topics, but two really interesting topics that should provide a lot of food for thought over coming days and weeks and months. And thank you again, Stephen. I'd like to thank Sarah, but Sarah had to duck out for another meeting. I'll send her an email to thank her, and Stephen, as well as Sarah, will be in touch with a proper, more official thank you in the coming days. But it truly has been a pleasure engaging with all of you. And yeah, thank you everyone for joining us for the 2023 conference. And I hope to see you again at future CNIE events or other events that are coming up in the next little while. And with that, I'm officially going to close things off by stopping the recording.
Recording stopped.
So thank you everyone for coming out.